I wonder how many of you have been intrigued by the problem of brain consciousness in your daily practice. I first encountered this problem in my first year of my BA studies, and ever since I'm obsessed by it. I wrote partial references to this problem in my books, teaching, and different presentations, but it took me all these years to come to my advanced age to form a coherent picture that I want to present to you. The age-old problem of brain consciousness was described by David Sears in these words: how does the brain get over the hump between electrochemistry to feelings? Gell-mann put it in his poetic words: how matter becomes imagination. For millennia, this fascinating problem has occupied the best mind who try to unveil this enigma, and many claim the problem to be that cannot be solved. I do not pretend here to have solved this problem, but I want to present a different perspective of complexity and to bring to your attention and judgment to decide whether we have achieved a breakthrough or a significant move forward. The subject of the second and third parts of the lecture derive from the beginning. In the second part, we suggest the division of the self into three functional parts: the higher self, the middle self, and the deep self. The third part, I want to suggest that this new perspective has meaningful implication on psychotherapy and psychopathology. I'll try within the limit of time to present its main headlines. So let's go for the journey. Let us see some landmarks. Plato said, the soul belongs to the world of forms and ideas, which is the real world. The soul and spirit are the real entities overpowering matter, the body. Aristotle said the contrary: the soul is but the expression of the body's activity, and with the death of the body, the soul perishes. Descartes said a dualistic position: the mechanistic body and the immortal souls are two separate entities that cannot be reduced to each other. By and large, the main attitude toward the body-mind problem could be summarized as follows: materialism versus idealism, Aristotle versus Plato. Idealism says the mind is the real thing, the material world, including the brain, is the fruit of perceptual representation of the mind. The opposite, materialistic approach, claims that the mind is the product of brain activity, nothing more. Dualism, it's the position of Descartes that say the soul and body are two different entities. And monism say that the mind and brain are different expressions of the same thing. I'll skip over hundreds of years of investigations and will come across our time. In recent years, brain scientists have made tremendous progress in the understanding of brain activity. A new multidisciplinary science, neuroscience, have been established in the 80s of the 20th century. Development in recent years in neuroimaging by advanced technological research apparatus such as fMRI, PET scan, MEG, NMR have dramatically changed the scene. These high-tech facilities join accelerated progress in brain lesion research and generated a great interest of neuroscientists by what was considered up to that moment an exclusive territory of philosophers. Notwithstanding the progress, the main difficulties have not been removed. The main discussion have been epitomized by David Chalmers, a prominent leader in the field, as the easy problem versus the hard problem. The easy problem, the relationship between brain structure, functions, and localizations, in this aspect, the progress done is immense. The hard problem is of a different order. How our aspiration, fears, dreams, and passions stem from biochemistry. The problem is not only about what comes first, brain or mind, in terms of cause and effect, but implicitly also raises the question as what is the real thing and what is its representation. On top of these theoretical problems, philosophers and scientists became challenged with the value of their works. What is the value of my philosophy of the mind if it is reduced to neurotransmitter, asked the philosopher. Is my methodology valid to solve this problem, asked the scientist, feeling that he formulates hypotheses that are on the limit of science. So we may understand that strong emotions are involved in this scientific philosophical debate. We want to suggest that looking at the brain from perspective of complexity entirely changes the scene. We are fascinated by the immense complexity and tremendous abilities of the human brain. The most complex thing in the universe, say Gell-mann. And we tend to ignore the fact that the brain is part of a wonderful complexity of the human organism, of life, and of the natural world. In addition to that, scientists sometimes tend to ignore the fact that although the brain is at the center of mental activity, there are many neurons in different regions of the body rather than in the brain that significantly influence the brain and human behavior. Not only that the brain is part of a larger system, the organism, to function well, it needs sensory and affective information from the body and from the environment. Experiments showed that without this information, the functioning of the brain becomes chaotic. This fact seems obvious to any scientist. However, most of the neuroscience researchers study intensively the brain as unique center of activity and not as part of complex system interacting with many complex systems around. How come? Let me suggest one possible lesson that we learn from research in psychology. It is called the law of the instrument. Behaviorism, one of the most prominent approaches in psychology at the 20th century, could not become so dominant without the invention of Skinner box that enabled very precise quantification of stimuli and responses in rates and pigeons. The invention of the tachytoscope, a device that displays an image for a measurable amount of time, promotes a whole field of psychology research of sensory perception far beyond the interest of most psychologists. Why is that? The reason seems evident. This instrument enables clean methodology, quantifiable and easy to get statistical validity to the researchers, hence easier publication in renowned journals and progress of the researchers in the academic hierarchy. We may suspect that the advanced technology being used in neuroscience had similar effect and contributed immensely to the brain research for the price of isolating the brain from its environment. We can see it in the affluence of neuroscientific research in subjects such as how diet influences the brain, different modules in the brain to musicians and non-musicians, and how does the Israeli-Arab conflict influence the brain? Of course, some of these research subjects are often significant as basic research, especially the last one on the Israeli-Arab conflict, in which my son, neuroscientist at Bar-Ilan University, is involved. Still, this subject of research go far beyond the core issues that were on the focus of interest of neuroscientists before the technological revolution in this field. They often ignore the fact that the brain is part of a larger complex adaptive system. So, to sum up this part, we notice that the recent years of study of the brain ignore to a large extent the brain's interrelations and interdependence with its environment. This fact, in our opinion, hampered the resolution of the problem. Physicist and Nobel Prize laureate Gell-mann suggests that the scientific project is composed of one integrative system made of different dynamic subsystems placed in a hierarchical order, from elementary physics to chemistry, biology, psychology, and we may add sociology and ecology at the top. Each discipline contains the law of the discipline below. However, the higher discipline accumulates additional information and develops additional law to deal with its particular environment. The scientific project, say Gell-mann, is the study of the laws of different disciplines. The study is performed from up-down and down-up, and the scientific project enables us to build bridges between the disciplines. This assumption reminds us of Kurt-Gödel's incompleteness theorem, according to which a consistent system is incomplete in its axioms, and its axioms cannot be proven within the system but by another system. Since the brain is studied by biologists and neuroscientists, it is part of the scientific project. Can we say the same about the self? The self is not a scientific fact. No one saw the fact by a microscope, telescope, or naked eye. But its existence seems obvious to us, more than black holes that astrophysicists believe to exist, although no one could ever see them. We believe with Damasio that the self exists as a concept representing the subjective experience, the qualia of the organism. When I talk to you, it is not a brain that communicates with other brains. Each of us has his own subjective experience, thoughts, feelings, and reaction while listening. The self, which is a central concept in psychology, fulfills the criteria for a complex adaptive system. It is dynamic, it adapts and evolves with the changing environment, it contains features of emergence and self-organization. Psychologists and psychiatrists observe these features daily within the therapy process. Scientific disciplines are complex adaptive systems that influence one another but not by causal relationship. They are modified by the law of synergy, coevolution, interdependence, and interrelations. Consequently to this, the body-brain cannot affect the mind by causal relationship, and we can talk of what comes first, brain or mind. The relations between the two are of coevolution. Any initial change in one of them may generate changes in the other and in the whole ecosystem. The atomic, physical, chemical, molecular, biological, cellular, psychological, behavioral, cultural, linguistic, social. For example, we know that the biofeedback, psychotherapy, mindfulness, life coaching, or mental training can change the mind by neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. In parallel, psychotropic drugs or hyper-complex functioning of the brain can generate insights and changes in the mind. These are relations of coevolution. Yet, we are going to see that while the existence of the self depends on the functioning brain, the self-functioning as a higher system in Gell-mann scientific hierarchy has additional features. The brain body contains integrated knowledge from millions of years of evolution. From evolutionary perspective, the brain was not programmed for thinking, but for survival. Brains are programmed by natural selection to search shelter, to forage food and provisions, to breathe, to sleep and dream, and in higher mammals to search for power and status, being alpha male or female, to play and search comfort and well-being. These features are represented in behaviors of humans and of animals. When a pride of lionesses prepare an ambush and they see that the prey escapes towards the woods, they might change the strategy and tactics in real time, in collaboration with the other lionesses to block the way of the prey. Animals experience feelings, learn from their experiences, and recall memories. Why are we not overwhelmed by the fact that the animal mind is a representation of the animal brain like we do with humans? The reason seems clear. Animals do not write poetry, do not fly to the moon, and cannot understand Kant's The Critique of Pure Reason. Besides having lower brain capacities, they do not have the language, culture, and civilizations of humans. Can we say that the accumulation of the extraordinary achievements of the human spirit originates only in the brain functioning? Or is it the result of accumulation of millions of human brains throughout human cultural histories? We know that the subjective experience of the few known cases of children that grew up in the wild, dissociated from human culture, is closer to the animals that took care of them rather than to humans. We can sum up this part by mentioning the following points. The brain and self are complex adaptive systems and are part of the scientific project. Thus, the question of what comes first, the mind or brain, is not relevant to complex adaptive systems. Brain and mind both evolved by coevolution and not by linear relationship of causality. The self is the agent of the brain, but contains additional information and features formed by human cultures. The self develops its cultural accomplishment and creates a unique complex adaptive system which by coevolution develops itself and the brain in an ever-growing synergy. Let us develop this subject further. The higher function of the self, like free choice, the creation of value system and personal vision, self-actualization, future planning, decision-making, the need to create meaningful, authentic life and to leave a footprint in the world beyond the material existence are the fruit of human cultures. These features coevolve with the brain that needs to support them and consequently changes by neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and creates more neuronal networks and thus develop and coevolves with the self. An individual can decide to starve himself to death, become a suicide bomber or burn himself to death because of social pressure, ideology, or his value system, and thus, with himself, he kills the brain. And it seems that the brain can do nothing about it. We agree with Francis Crick that consciousness is the result of complex activity of many neurons together, like our computers that are based on simple connection between electric chips and produce wonderful complex programs and applications. However, the higher part of the self, mainly influenced by culture, can be demonstrated in this metaphor as an artificial intelligence device. Artificial intelligence devices, as sophisticated as they are, depends on the hardware, like consciousness upon the brain. If we remove their energy source, they will stop functioning. However, an artificial intelligence device could be programmed to develop independently a way to create backup systems. Then it becomes independent of its programmer creator, as we sometimes see in horror films where computers take over humans. Likewise, the existence of culture depends on human brains, but its products goes far beyond. Our children that grew up in the internet and smartphone have different culture, hence different minds and brain than ours. Those of us who have young enough children realize it now, and we shall probably feel it in much more during the years to come. So far, we saw that the brain is an organ designed by natural selection for survival. An automatic pilot is formed in the human self, as in other species, as an operational agent of the brain imper complex activity. The higher self functions such as free choice, the creation of value system, etc., are the fruit of human cultures. The distinction between the humans and natural world is neither in their brain volume, nor is it in the human genome that is not very different than that of other primates. It is not even the coevolution of the brain and the self. Coevolution of the brain and of primary self in animals is simply the act of learning, existing also in the natural world. The distinction of the human self from the natural world is the coevolution of the brain with the human cultural products. These products have been generated by millions of human brains throughout history, and their effect on the brain and the self in return is exponential. Following my previous words, we can divide the self into three functional parts. This division reminds us of the triune brain model suggested by Paul MacLean. The higher self includes the self-predisposition to create value systems, meaningfulness, free choice, spirituality, etc. The high self is inseparable from culture and from society in which lives the individual. The middle self includes the self and the automatic pilot, highly correlated with what Gell-mann entitled as System 1. System 1 is the operational aspect of the self, formed by natural selection and composed of algorithms of behavior assimilated in the brain to create rapid action essential for survival. The deep self is highly correlated with the core self, or the nuclear self. It is composed of collective memories that unite humanity. It is epitomized by information formed by phylogenetic and ontogenetic human, evolutionary, and individual experiences. The deep self fits the middle and the higher part of the self. It forms the automatic pilot behaviors in the middle self And in the higher self, it creates representations which express the human life story, such as human values, myths, ceremonies, archetypes, and the ground for the foundation of human cultures. The triune self has important implications on psychopathology and psychotherapy that we shall mention here very briefly and schematically. Psychopathology. We suggest that many types of psychopathology derive from discordance between the biological, the body-brain system, and the psychocultural, the consciousness self. What does it mean? We say that the brain is programmed to increase chances of survival and enhance learning to better adapt to changing environments in nature and to avoid life-threatening situations. However, humans do not usually live in nature, but within a civilization where the self is mainly exposed to symbolic hazards. For example, be the self constantly criticized by parents, humiliated by teachers in front of friends, or by boss in front of colleagues. In situations as such, the self will react like the animal in the wild to form a fight-flight responses and to develop stress reactions. While in the wild, once the threat is over, the parasympathetic branch takes control and brings the body back into a balanced state. In human cultures, the self forms new neurological response patterns activated in similar situations as if they were life-threatening and not symbolic hazards. Consequently, the self creates repeating stress formation in form of shame, regret, and low self-value. Some other stress formation go down to the deep self and might create information within the deep self, not accessible to the higher self in forms of anxiety, depression, wounded self-value, etc. Psychotherapy, we can mention only the guidelines. Let me just say that we offer a meta-structure that can incorporate many of the existing forms of psychotherapy. The first stage of psychotherapy is to separate the functioning of the middle self from unsuccessful learning patterns formed by the higher or deep self and to restore stress-free, spontaneous activity. The separation can be done by various forms of psychotherapy that we cannot describe here. When the middle self becomes liberated from unsuccessful learning patterns, its functioning becomes spontaneous and constantly improving by new learning from its experiences. The second stage in psychotherapy is the creation of synchronization between the parts of the self. While the higher self provides the individual with meaningfulness, the deep self is more related to authenticity. When the two meet in the individual, he may experience a flow-like situation. As described by Csikszentmihalyi, flow is the intense and focused concentration on the present moment, merging of action and awareness, loss of ego feeling and self-consciousness, and lack of time perception. We suggest that these situations are not assimilated with the search of happiness so popular today. This situation derives from a sense of authenticity emanating from the deep self and meaningfulness originating in the higher self and the activation within the middle self. So our final purpose is facilitating and empowering the client to exercise a flow-like situation where authentic and meaningful behaviors are performed spontaneously in the here and now, co-evolving with a brain that creates new patterns of activity. Since the self and the brain use the same meta-language of complex adaptive system, once this behavior is assimilated into the brain, it will continue to enhance the new behaviors in the integrated self. We discussed the coevolution of the brain and the self and its implication. We saw that from perspective of complexity, the question of what comes first, brain or mind, become non-relevant or even a logical error. In Gell-mann terms, we concentrated upon the biological and psychological disciplines as complex adaptive systems. Our theory does not exclude the study of other disciplines and could be integrated into quantum physics as well as Kundalini meditation, study of cultures as complex adaptive system. As Gell-mann say, the scientific project enables us to build bridges between the disciplines. This, however, is a subject for another conference.